The third principle of education is to work from near to the far, from that which is to that which shall be. The basis of a man's nature is almost always, in addition to his soul's past, his heredity, his surroundings, his nationality, his country, the soil from which he draws sustenance, the air which he breathes, the sights, sounds, habits to which he is accustomed. They mold him not the less powerfully because insensibly. From that, then, we must begin. We must not take up the nature by the roots from the earth in which it must grow and surround the mind with images and ideas of a life which is alien to that in which he must physically move. If anything has to be brought in from outside, it must be offered, not forced on the mind. A free and natural growth is the condition of genuine development. There are souls which naturally revolt from their surroundings and seem to belong to another age and clime. Let them be free to follow their bent, but the majority languish, become empty, become artificial, if artificially molded into an alien form. It is God's arrangement for mankind that they should belong to a particular nation, age, society, that they should be children of the past, possessors of the present, creators of the future. The past is our foundation, the present our material, the future our aim and summit. Each must have its due and natural place in a national system of education.
Thank you, Julian. You want to share your views with Steph?
Well, I think I felt before this feeling from my teaching days that looking into the eyes of whoever you are exchanging information with, to recognize that they are a soul. And we, of course, think of Teilhard, or even in popular culture, Sting. We are spirits in a material world, and we aren't mindful of that at all, generally, in our exchanges with students. So I think it's important for the teachers to realize that it may be a very old soul they're speaking of. This is certainly clear in the Tibetan tradition, where they recognize the reincarnation of teachers, and from a very early age are respecting that younger person as someone who was a teacher in a previous life. So I think it's an interesting supposition to begin any exchange in education by having that premise.
Thank you, Julie. Andrea, you want to say?
Just on a practical level, when I first read this, what you know as a teacher is you cannot present the opportunity to learn something totally new unless it has some connection to what that child already knows. Can't know everything, but there has to be a way for it to take root in something already familiar, to grow into something more than what he or she has. So I view this as very practical advice for anybody who wants to encounter another soul. You can't just spring things on people and say, I know you've never heard of this, so you'll love algebra. You know, no, it has to have some number connection. So that seems to be so true for my teaching. I thought, well, everybody knows that. But I think not.
Yeah, I mean, I think even from a parent's perspective, just understanding our own child, we kind of support and encourage them. Okay. David?
So I think this principle is in many ways the most complex and the most open to in both interpretation and misinterpretation. So for example, the nature of the social world that we live in now is so radically different than it was 100 years ago. And I wouldn't claim to know phenomenologically what the experience is of a child being born now, but I know that it's radically different in relationship to all these notions of identity and place and membership. So, unless the civilization completely falls apart, which I'm sure is very possible, this will continue. The globalization will continue, and if the positive outweighs the negative, which is always possible, I think children growing up now will have a radically different notion of their identity, their place, their access to other human beings on the planet, and so on and so on. And so that's the problem with what is near and what is far. So, and I think that while the other two principles, are radical from the mainstream society, they're clear. And I don't really see them, at least unless, we evolve into the supermind and become a different species, and then, all bets are for Homo sapiens are off. I don't really see them changing in their applicability. But this one really feels more, parts of it feel constant, and parts of it feel to me really rooted, in 1920 or whenever, in the external reality in which Sri Aurobindo lived. And I think it really goes back again to the potential for, literal interpretation, as opposed to recognizing that these things have different meanings. These words have different meanings for people who are being born and growing up now, as opposed to when we all were doing that, even the youngest of us, I'm gathering, was at least 40 or 50 years ago, and the world was a completely different place in so many ways.
I think it depends on the country and place and our own environment. Thank you, David.
Well, it does, but there's the nature of the technological innovation or invasion, depending how you look at it, I would argue, is decreasing the particularity and the commonality of a child growing up in Lagos, in a wealthy family, is a whole lot less than it used to be than a child growing up in St. Louis.
Thank you, David. Mira? You're muted.
I observe the children, about 5 to 6 year old children in our hometown village school. And so my brother introduced this vocabulary that is very close to them and, and involved their own experiences. And so the children were so enthusiastic when the teacher brought up one of the vocabulary items, and the children would talk about their own experiences related to the word. And so they just would be so concentrated and, and focused to talk about it. And I think, so that's a good way to go from the near to the far. And also I feel like the motivation, emotion, and interest are all connected. And if we can just help them to choose that is the age appropriate to them, I think they'll reach their potential. And I think that's what I observed in the school there. And so, yeah, thank you.
Martha?
Yes. I read this from more of a psychological perspective. As a licensed clinical social worker, I was trained in the principle of start where the client is, start where the patient is. And I think it's very much in line with what Sri Aurobindo says in the third principle. It's principally honoring the nature of the individual and that culture, the culture of the family, the culture of his or her surroundings. Any teaching needs to, as Andrea said, really needs to resonate with that and have some sense of familiarity. And as he goes on, as Sri Aurobindo goes on and describes that some people are people of the past, that's something to be recognized too. And that to me really indicates the psychology behind the statement. That is that the personality and the values, the inherent nature of the individual needs to be recognized and honored and respected in the whole learning process. And Sri Aurobindo points out very pointedly, really, that forcing a child or an adult learner, anyone, into a different mold than suits their nature just isn't going to work. It's going to result in revolt and even harm. So that was principally what I took from the message. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Marco?
Yes, I also see this point that we should consider the past of children also culturally as a soul, and also, how can we say, there's a surface personality, so to speak, which is what he says, the nationality, the country, the culture, the heredity, and so on. And this is a big problem in modern and the classical school system. The classical school system is a system that tendentially tries to find the size that fits for all. And when you try to find the size that fits for all, you are precisely going against this third principle, which translated says we should do exactly the opposite. Unfortunately, it is deeply structured in our schools, at least in German schools for sure. And I can only imagine what these poor children are going through who come from the war in Syria. We have a lot of children and refugee children that come, hundreds and thousands of children that come to German schools suddenly. They cannot even speak the language. And let alone they are not in their surrounding. That's not their heredity, that's not their nationality, that's not their soil and country. And obviously, yes, there are a lot of problems with these children, and they develop a lot of, not all of course, but it can be seen statistically that they are much more problematic. And I imagine a school system that respects the roots, the origin, the history, and also the soul, the character, the imagination, the skills of every child separately, which, however, would need a completely different structure and concept, school concept. And it cannot just be implemented by some literary form and the conventional school system. And so, yes, that's what I see here in this principle, that we will have to work a lot on this aspect, that we will have to see how to implement in a new form of educational system something that allows every soul to develop naturally, as Sri Aurobindo says here.
I mean, wanted to say one more thing. I mean, one of the things that struck me, this is kind of in 1985 when I visited the Sri Aurobindo ashram, and I interviewed all these teachers, you know, in the International Center, was that they agreed to disagree about pedagogy. And there were multiple forms of pedagogy, some of which were really, you know, and from my progressive American viewpoint, you know, reactionary, very teacher-centered. And then there were others that were more progressive, and there were folks who had Montessori backgrounds, there were folks who had Waldorf backgrounds, but there was a whole agreement. But what they agreed about was the encounter of the soul. That was the central pedagogy. And of course, the way that the community was arranged, you know, the fact that they had 20 hours of responsibility as teachers a week, that they had 10 hours of contact time a week, that they had very small groups, very personalized groups. You know, it invited that they lived in a spiritually oriented community. It invited a soul orientation. They were devotees of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. I mean, you know, all these things led to, and I'm sure there were variations in the extent to which the teachers, yeah, I'm looking for, you know, I don't want to use the conventional accomplishment words, in which the teachers engaged with the soul of their students. But I interviewed, you know, I think 40 or 45 teachers over the time. People were very interested in being interviewed, and you know, there was a universal articulation, even though they very much disagreed about external pedagogy.
So Martha, how do you see as a counselor, because we see a lot of younger adults and children facing a lot of psychological challenges, because I feel there's a gap between who they are and whom they're trying to present themselves.
Yes, that's especially true in the middle school years, as we experience them here in the US. That middle school age is one of significant searching, identity development, trying out different styles, and so on. So in the past, I'm now retired, but in the past I worked with in schools with a number of levels. I was sent by our local public health agency. My job was to visit in a rural county numerous elementary schools and a middle school and the high school for that county. It was a small rural county, so they had only one high school. So I saw pretty much the full range of problems that children experience in that way. And the search for identity is certainly something that I dealt with a great deal. The tension between the family's perception of who they think they are and then who they want the child to become, what kind of person they want the child to become. Mixed race children seeking for identity, and especially in a rural environment where there are fewer role models to identify with, you know, in mixed race situations. So, and then, you know, children coming from drug using homes where the child was either open about that and thought it was perfectly normal and gave me examples of behavior that I found were really shocking. And then children who struggled to cover that up and put on a really good front, and you know, aspirational behaviors by children in the sort of lower ranges, less educated families, lower ranges of society, aspiring to be beyond that. So this the genuineness with which you approach anyone you're trying to relate to, especially when the children are children in these developmental stages where they're very much in flux and seeking their own identities. The genuineness with which you approach them enables, by modeling that. I mean, that was one of the things that I relied on in my work, was to model that kind of openness and lack of specific expectations in order for the child to be able to be him or herself within that particular room where we were trying to have the counseling. I could speak to specific kinds of situations, but I think this search for identity and genuineness, you know, when you're still trying to discover who you are, is one of the most challenging things developmentally.
Thank you, Martha. Any other comments?
Yeah, I love teaching middle school when I had that age range. And I certainly echo everything you said. I think the thing that is difficult for emerging people, people who've emerged and haven't quite fully formed yet, is that there's no sense that it's okay for them to make a mistake. That is, they could try on a personality, and if it doesn't suit them, they can do another one. You can be a goth, you can be a girly girl, you could be a jock, whatever you like. And we don't really give them permission to just try different ones and then say, oh, it's okay, just be somebody else. It's too bad, because sometimes you get to be in your 30s and 40s and you suddenly discover, oh, nobody cares what I am, I'm just gonna be myself. So I think you're exactly right. You have to, the authenticity of your interest in whatever they care to share is sort of the groundwork that lets you go forward. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Andrew. We see, I mean, a lot of young teachers, you know, they themselves are young adults, and when they're not able to be themselves or face their own challenges, and they're not able to handle the children in the classroom. So how do we foresee providing that training or opportunity for these young teachers or young adults who are going to be teachers? And that's what I heard from a lot of educators, and especially in public schools, teachers are quitting, and we know there's a shortage of teachers right now. And teachers are the foundation of the future.
Yeah, I think this is a point, yeah, because we are speaking of something which is ideal, and then in the everyday practice, it's not that easy, because if you have a class and you are still forced to be a teacher in a teacher-centered and blackboard-centered, I don't know how you say in English, frontal teaching, yeah? Where there's a blackboard in the front, the teacher in the front, and implicitly you have a hierarchy, bottom-down hierarchy, and with 30 children, for example, it's hard to teach to every children according to his or her character, soul, skills, tendencies, or whatever. And that's why I also said these are things that will need in one way or another a structural change. What, of course, the teacher as such, there are a lot of techniques, a lot of tricks, a lot of methods, teaching pedagogical methods with which one can come up with these challenges. But I think it's not enough. We will need a different school, not only different teachers, to bring forth really this project. And I think, who was it? I think it was Martha who said, we need to give the children the permission of being somebody else. I think it was Martha, I don't recall. And Andrea, okay. Yeah, I think this goes to the point. It is precisely that. We need a teaching method, a teaching environment where children are allowed of being not necessarily themselves, but to experiment to be someone else, which is not necessarily the same. Because the point is that as every soul, the soul has to find itself, which means that every child has to find its own identity by him or herself. It's not, we can also very skilled teachers and highly intelligent adults and whatever, but I don't think we really know what the identity of that children is, even if it's my child. At the end of the story, it is everyone, and this fits also for adults. And I think this has also a lot to do with ethnocentrism. We have this rise of ethnocentrism nowadays precisely because a lot of adults don't know exactly what their own identity is. They don't find themselves, but because most of the cases, they have not been allowed to be themselves. I don't say that that's their only cause, but one of the main causes, I think. So it is in this paradigm, in this optics, that I think that we should see also education.
And one of the things we have to do is persuade teachers that it is not a sign of health, that there's no talking in the classroom, that there's only order and there's only routine. You know, that's the classical model. Everybody sit down, be quiet, now pay attention. That's wrong. It just doesn't work that way, folks. I absolutely agree with what you're saying, Marco, about being able to make those trials for yourself. I think it would be helpful for teachers if they saw themselves as being able to try different things. Sometimes I'm delighted to hear that in the ashram, people agreed to disagree and they could do all kinds of things that seem sensible to them. But that does not happen in most teacher ed biz schools. So I had a thought about your question, Lakshmi. You and I have said this before. This little group works together really well. Our board works together really well. And it has some qualities in common. One is it's a small group. The scale of the group makes a difference. If you have more than 7 or 8 people in a group, not everybody can talk. We progress by conversations through shared work, that is looking at a text, or looking at an idea, and then trying to ask questions of each other to see how far we can take it. If we could get teachers in small enough groups to have these conversations, it would be no more extra work. It would be some time out of their lives, but not a lot. I think that happened a lot when I was teaching. We had teams for grade levels. And it's one of the things I miss the most about not being in the classroom. This is a great substitute, but I think to think about ways we can get teachers in small hubs and give them something to gnaw on would be a real helpful way for them to progress. And we could start with the 3 principles. It's worked for us. So that is all.
But one piece of data, you know, I heard this interview on Morning Edition, which is a public radio show in the United States, Marco. They're interviewing teachers, you know, on a regular basis. What are you doing now? Some of them are teaching online. Some of them are struggling. So this is a high school teacher in one of the San Francisco suburbs. And she has 5 kids. I think the age range was like 6 to 15 or something. And she said the most interesting thing, which was that prior to March, you know, her experience of her own children in school was that they seemed to be pretty average. And, you know, she had kind of gotten used to that idea. And what she discovered in the spring of this year, when her children were removed from the expectations of public schooling in the United States, was that her children actually had profound interests and capacities that were kind of astonishing to her.
I've had this conversation with another group of former teachers just the other day. And the one thing that we were acutely aware of is all of us in the group were educated ourselves. We had a deep interest in the kids we were raising or teaching, and made conscious efforts to try to encourage engagement. I'm worried about the kids whose parents work 2 jobs, are stressed, are worried about where the rent is coming from, don't have education themselves that allows them to expand the vision of what their kids have access to. That concerns me, because I think that's where the trouble is. It's, to some extent, being freed from public education is a great thing for people in our particular circumstances, but not for everybody. And that's a long concern of mine for a lot of reasons. But this right now, I think is a lost time for these kids.
Thank you all. I think it's time. Marco, did you end the recording?
No, still not. Should I?
Yeah.
Okay, let's end it.
So
Bye-bye.
for